So I guess, should we get started? Let's go ahead and get started. So once again, we'd like to welcome everyone for coming tonight. For those of you who are not with us tonight, this session is being recorded. For those that do not join us, this particular meeting tonight is sponsored by Affirmation, LGBTQ plus Mormons, families, and friends. While Affirmation generally is known for the intersectionality between the LDS Mormon Church and LGBTQ plus folks. The topic we're discussing tonight goes beyond the scope of religion or one's spiritual path. And so tonight we have a very special guest, and we're so excited to have Neca Allgood with us. Neca is the mother of 3 adult children. She's a former president of Mama Dragons and a former board member of Affirmation, LGBTQ Mormons, families, and friends. Neca is passionate about defending the rights and fundamental human needs of LGBTQ plus folks. She's testified at the Utah State Capitol beside her son Grayson, defending the fundamental human rights. And she has also this special gift for helping people open their minds and their hearts to better understand not only proposed laws and what's at stake, but she also has a gift for helping parents who are new to the journey of being a parent to an LGBTQ plus child. When I was learning the whole parenting thing, I never learned how to be a parent of an LGBTQ plus child, and there can be some different challenges there. Just things that our children face that our cisgender straight children do not face. And so we're just so excited to have Neca here with us tonight to share with us her knowledge and to hopefully help us to know how we can navigate. Tonight, I know we've got Utah, Idaho, and Florida represented in this meeting. We were just saying that all we need is Texas, and we kind of have the Fantastic Four for all of the not so wonderful things happening in the nation right now. So we'll turn the time over to you. Thank you so much, Neca.
Thank you. We kind of have a twofold topic agenda tonight. We want to discuss how we deal with all of the political assault that seems to be happening on the LGBTQ community, and particularly on trans children. But we also want to talk about helping ourselves and helping our kids be resilient in the face of those attacks. So I wanted to spend just a little time talking about resilience first, and then we'll kind of cycle back to that at the end. I'm going to drop in the chat a link to an article by the American Psychological Association that is about teaching resilience to children. And this is a general resource, but it's useful for the topic we have at hand. And they make a number of points in that article. And then they also kind of talk about talking about resilience in an age-appropriate way to very young children, elementary age children, middle school teens, kind of say how we might approach that in a different way depending on the ages of our children. But there are a couple of points that I particularly want to highlight. One is their first point I can speak is called making connections. And I think this is particularly important when we are parents of an LGBTQ child. It's important to acknowledge that when our kids come out, our kids and us may lose people from our lives, right? There are people who aren't ready to handle that and pull back a little bit or step away altogether. Or there are people who continue to spew really harmful messages at our kids, and we have to, create some distance there to protect our kids. What that means is that a lot of times when our kids come out, their community of support shrinks a little. Sometimes it shrinks a lot. And so it's very important that our kids and us have community and connection of support. Human beings are social creatures, right? We don't live independently. And it's important that we have people in our lives who have our backs for when we need help. And also, it's very important we have people in our lives that we have their backs, because giving to our communities is just as important as getting for our communities, as us as human beings. So if we have a child who has come out recently in, the last few days, maybe the last few years, and we look around and say, my child doesn't have enough community of support, or I don't have enough community of support, or in particular, my child doesn't have queer peers who share their experiences that they can talk with, or my child doesn't have LGBTQ adult role models so that they can see a healthy future for themselves. We can make a conscious effort to grow and strengthen those communities of support. And it's a very important facet of resilience that we learn how to intentionally cultivate people who are supporters. It's also sometimes useful to our children to explicitly point out to them who belongs in their community of support. Say, grandma is one of the people who loves you and helps you and takes care of you. She is part of your support network and you are part of hers. I actually had an experience related to that idea. My oldest and youngest children are both on the autism spectrum, where they're very bright, very verbal, very odd, wonderful young men. When my oldest son, Cale, was about 12, he was going through a period of time where he attended church with me, but the part of the church service where he was, in Sunday school with his age mates was not going well. And so he didn't go. He just hung out in the halls. And he was a good kid. He wasn't in the halls causing trouble, but he was just hanging out in the halls. And there was an adult man in our congregation who would chat with him while he was in the halls, not in a creepy way, just, being a supporter. And after a while, I said to Cale, that person, he's a friend of yours. He is someone you could rely on if there were a problem. And some of our kids with awesome social skills could figure that out for themselves. But my son at 12, I wasn't sure could figure that out, that those conversations they had were, his way of saying, hey, I'm your friend, I have your back. And so we can point out to our kids, here are the people in your life who are your friends and your support network. Sometimes we can ask our kids, so who's your support network? And sometimes they may be able to come up with age mates. And what we want to do is say, yes, that's true. You also have adults in your life who are part of your support network. Who are they? And help them see the adults beyond just mom and dad that are adults they could rely on. And those are important things we can do to help build resilience by helping build social connection. Another point that the APA article makes is what they called nurture a positive self-view. And in light of politics, how I view that is helping our children see their power. Lots of times kids feel very powerless. They're small. And even when our kids are no longer small, when they're teenagers, they may look at all the complications of the political system and just say, I have no control over that. I have no input on that. I am powerless. But we can help our kids see things that they can do. And maybe them by themselves won't make meaningful political change, but they can help see themselves as part of a huge group of people who care about the same issues they do and can help them. I know a few years back, I was talking to my son, Grayson, and he was saying, oh, I feel so politically powerless. And I said, wait a minute, you have testified before House and Senate legislative committees. You helped change Utah's law because, Grayson and I testified in Utah as part of getting housing and employment non-discrimination protections extended to LGBTQ people. And I'm like, whoa, you should not be feeling powerless. You should be going, yeah, and so it is worthwhile to help our children see where they can act with power, because that's something that helps us be resilient. When we feel powerless, it impacts our ability to bounce back from hard things. All right, let's transition and talk politics for a little while. It's such a fun year for politics. There's like 300 horrible bills related to LGBTQ issues running the country. There's so many, it's hard to track. But those hundreds of bills are actually very similar bills run over and over again in different states. And there's reason that they're also similar. Those bills are all based on model bills that are being aggressively promoted by a couple of very conservative political think tanks. And the Alliance Defending Freedom is one. They always have such wonderful sounding names. And it's like, ooh, you're a hate group. So it's important to recognize that these bills are very similar, and each legislator will maybe craft a few words differently. And then as it goes through the legislative process, those bills may get amended to be a little different. But because the foundational model bill that they're crafted on is so similar, we can use similar arguments to help people understand the harm those bills would cause, right? So knowing that, let's talk about types of bad bills. And I'm going to start with the bills that are running fast and furious this year that are targeting specifically transgender minors. And top of the list are bills that ban or severely limit the ability of transgender minors to access medical care. Sometimes they are just bans on bottom surgery or sex reassignment surgery, gender reassignment surgery, which those are not pretty much never done on minors. So sometimes they're very deceptive bills. We're going to ban this horrible practice. And it's like, yeah, you want to ban this horrible practice that almost no one does. But sometimes they're bans on other types of transition-related surgery. Sometimes they're also bans on hormones, and sometimes they're even bans on puberty blockers. So they can vary a lot in what they attack. So if you were trying to explain to someone what the problem with a medical ban for transgender minors, what would you say? Just unmute yourself, and I'm tossing the challenge out there.
Well, I think the only weapon I have is just my story and my children's stories. I don't know how to take on political dialogue necessarily, but that's what I would share.
Okay, so thank you so much. My recommendation when you're trying to explain the problems with these bills is to always start with a story and then give people facts, but they need a story, a person, a real person to hang the facts on, right? So when you said I'd share my story, yeah, do that. Now, what if your kid's in the closet? What if they're going stealth? You know what? I hate that term, but I don't know a better one. Um, uh, what do we do then to share a story?
I have a couple of friends that are in that situation that sent anonymous letters to the representatives, or had me share their story with representatives. I also think it's just powerful to have, as an ally, to say, my friend has a child who's trans, and this has been my experience with them, without outing anybody. You still can talk about your relationships with trans people without naming names.
That's excellent. Also, you can say, I have a friend who is a mother of a trans child, and she told me that blah, 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 and I'm glad to be that friend, right? My son and I did a video for Equality Utah that has got over 50,000 views at this point. And so my son is as out as it is possible to be. You do not endanger anyone if you share our story. So yeah, that stories are an excellent place to start. So moving on from the story, Heidi, you wanted to chime in.
Kind of going along with that same thing. Just earlier this week, my next door neighbor was sharing an experience, and her husband is like a VP of a very prominent organization, and you do not speak politics. Like, you just can't in his particular position. But here he was at this dinner with a bunch of other high-level executives, and here we are in Florida. So of course the conversation comes up, and he said, wait a minute. And he kind of like stopped everyone, and he shared a personal experience, and they're like, oh yeah, the schools and the teachers and people are just trying to make everybody gay or trans or whatever. And he just paused and stopped for a moment, and he told just like a very just shortened version of the story of my son, and said, wait a minute, we've got a next door neighbor, and this is, her son, and he's gone through this and this and this. And just the fact of humanizing it and kind of flipping the script for them, they just paused and they're like, we had never thought of that before. We had never thought that they don't have adult role models to look after. We had never thought that all of the media and all of the movies and all of the cartoons and all of the what have you, even the gender reveal, like everything is so cisgender, heteronormative. And so out the gates, I mean, that's already putting our LGBTQ plus kiddos behind. And it was just such a powerful moment for him. And then this group of executives who would have never thought otherwise, other than, but he felt he needed to share that story.
Yeah, thank you. That's excellent. Once we've shared a story, then we want to hang some key facts or some key ideas onto that story. So for example, if we're talking about medical bans, a narrative you hear people share implies that parents are deciding their kid is transgender. They're going right out and putting their kid on hormones and surgery. And I mean, there's this message that like people are doing genital surgery on 10-year-olds, and no. And so it's something you can share that there are guidelines, the WPATH guidelines, for example, which is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. And their guidelines say that the child has to have seen a therapist, gotten a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, before they could even go on hormone blockers, right? And that those decisions are always made in consultation with a medical doctor, a therapist, the parents, and the child, right? They are not just spur of the moment decisions. They're made very carefully. And they're made by the people with the information and the expertise. And that does not include your legislators. Right? Another way you can push back against some of those bills is that many of the bills of the medical ban bills are carefully crafted so that they only target transgender children. So in Utah, for example, a girl, who is still a minor, a 15 or 16-year-old, can, with her parents' consent, get breast enhancement surgery, right? And they carefully crafted the bill so that it would not remove that right unless the child is transgender, right? So our Constitution has something to say about equal protection under the law, a law that targets one group of people for a specific restriction and lets another group of people continue, right, is unconstitutional. And many of these bills, as they are crafted, are unconstitutional because they specifically target one group of people for different treatment than everyone else. So that's another example of a point you could make to clarify the problems with these bills. Also, any of the bills that target transgender youth have a broader target than it seems. And I want to talk about another type of bills that target transgender minors, which are sports bans. And what they are usually designed to do is to specifically prevent transgender girls for playing girls' sports, right? By claiming that they are boys who want to play girls' sports, right? Last year, one of those bills ran in Utah and passed. But one of the things that we were talking about is, look, right now there's one child in the state of Utah that they could find who was a transgender girl participating in girl sports. One. I'm like, why are you spending all of this legislative energy on one child, right? But did that bill really only harm that one girl? And the answer is no, right? Every transgender person I talked to in Utah, whether they were an adult or a child, felt targeted by that bill because the bill others them. It implies that somehow transgender people are not to be believed, that they aren't really who they claim to be, but instead they are trying to masquerade, trying to deceive people about their gender so that they can get some advantage, in this case, some sports advantage. But that's a very harmful and insulting message, right? And it hits broadly. I know my transgender son, Grayson, bless him, is not an athletic person. He's a good long distance runner, but not a fast runner. He's never going to win the marathon. He's not going to win the elementary school marathon. He's just, and he never wanted to play team sports. But those bills still felt so hostile to him, right? And we can invite people to stop and think about how those bills affect the broader community of transgender people and how it others them. So there's another class of bills that target transgender people, which are bills that put up additional barriers for transgender people to change their legal documents to match their gender identity. You know, to let them change their name, to let them change their gender marker on their official documents, to let them update their birth certificates, right? And again, the message behind those bills is that transgender people who try to update their documents are trying to deceive us. You know, that they're, and again, these target transgender women selectively. You don't see very many of people getting all irate about this and saying, yes, this was a girl who wanted to go into the men's bathroom. They're all about men trying to go into the women's bathroom and then close the door and pee. Yeah, what? Utah has several bills running this year that are trying to impact transgender people's ability to update their legal documents and or require that birth certificates always show that they've been amended or things like that, or just prohibit it entirely until someone is an adult. Those, we can make the point that those bills do harm because they imply that transgender people are lying about who they are. We can also point out that they put transgender people at risk, right? Transgender people, particularly transgender women, are at greater risk for violence. And that violence is predominantly addressed at people who are at the intersection of gender identity and race, right? Most of the murders of transgender people in our country are of Black or Latina trans women, which is terrifying. And I want my trans women friends to be safe, to walk to the grocery store, and to be safe to ride the bus, and to be safe to go to a performance and then be able to safely walk to her car after the performance is over at night and get in her car and safely drive home. And bills that prohibit transgender people from having identity documents that match their gender out them, right? So like a trans woman who wants to go to a bar and have a drink, if they are needing to check ID and her ID has an M instead of an F for the gender marker, right? She has just outed herself to the person at the door or the bartender or whatever, and that compromises her safety. All right, now we're going to move on to a few of the other types of bad bills. One group of bad bills that is running around are bills that attempt to regulate drag shows. And particularly, a lot of those bills imply that because people are dressed in drag, that is adult content, and people have to be warned that children should not be exposed to it. Now, there are drag shows that are adult content, right? And the people who sponsor those are usually very frank about this is not an appropriate performance for children. A lot of times those are held in bars where they card you and make sure you're 21 before you can get in, right? But these bills are trying to target a different kind of drag performance, like drag queen story hours. So is a drag queen story hour adult content? Is a person, regardless of their genitalia, who is dressed in women's clothing and wearing, you know, female coded makeup, does that make it adult content? I mean, this is, you know, a story hour, they're wearing clothing, we can't actually see their genitals. right? Um, why should that be labeled adult content? I mean, it's an important question to ask. And when we talked about our children having community connections, one of the points I made is that our LGBTQ children need queer adult role models. And there's a subset of gay boys and young men who are very attracted to the dress up aspect in what are typically coded as female clothes, right? Should they be denied access to adult role models who also enjoy that same hobby? You know, why would we consider that adult content? When I wear a dress out in public, people aren't asking that I have a warning label that it's adult content because I'm wearing a bra and a shirt and a skirt or whatever, you know. Why would that be different if the person inside the clothing identifies as a gay man, right? And again, there's a broader issue at work with that attack on drag content being shown to children, right? Because those bills also do send messages, which is that your gender non-conforming behavior is unacceptable and it's sexual, right? And it's not, right? Boys who like to wear pink shirts are not making a statement about sex. They're making a statement about liking pink and wanting to be free to wear it. Another group of bad bills that are running along this year are a variety of don't say gay type bills. And very similar to drag shows, what those bills seem to be trying to do is saying that someone's existence as an LGBTQ person is somehow sexualized content in a way that a heterosexual relationship is not. Right? And that's false, right? It's very similar with book bans. There are a lot of states that are proposing book bans. And sometimes those bans may not be written in a way that helps us see that they are specifically targeting the LGBTQ community, but in fact, they are. They're trying to send this message that a book that has a character in a same-sex relationship is somehow not appropriate for children because it might lead them to be gay. I mean, we need to talk about that, right? Because the facts are clear that people don't become gay because they see a gay character in a book. Just like our little gay kids don't become straight because they see a straight character in a book. They see plenty of straight characters in books as children, and it doesn't change who they are. And so those book bans are a place where we can make common cause with the broader civil rights community. A lot of times those book bans also want to target Black or Asian or Latina people sharing their stories, right? And sometimes they're couched in the, we want to make sure people, or children in particular, don't hear history that is critical of our country, right? But what happens when we remove all of the critical stuff from history? Anybody want to?
It's just propaganda.
Right. The other thing is that sooner or later, our children are going to encounter some truthful history, which isn't always pretty, right? And part of getting an education is not just knowing that there's, not always rosy history out there, but also knowing how to deal with it. Saying, yeah, the guy who wrote the Constitution had this very lofty language about humans being endowed by their creator with the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, that's actually in the Declaration of Independence, sorry. But he kept slaves. And, that he enslaved people. How does that fit with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? We can have appropriate, age-appropriate discussions with children about the fact that people are complicated, that we don't always live up to our self-professed goals, that, yeah, he did some really good things. He also did some things that we don't agree with and would condemn. And that's really an important part of having an education, and that bills that try to remove books that tell the truth about history aren't teaching history, and they do harm. So those are some of the types of bad bills that are out there. What do we do about them? Sometimes what we do about them is easy. In conversations, we bring up the problems with those bills with the people we're talking to, with our friends face to face, with people who do posts that concern us on social media. If we're finding a way to be tactful about it in business meetings, there are just the times we do have those conversations face to face. Also, we need to have those conversations with the people who represent us. Okay. And that can feel like an extremely frustrating process. I just want to acknowledge that. I send emails to my state and federal legislators regularly about bills. And it's only very seldom that they vote the way I would like them to. Sometimes when they do vote the way I like them to, I send them a thank you note, just because, I figure at least once a month they're getting an email from me saying, oh, support this thing that I know there's not a snowball's chance in hell that you're actually going to support because you're in a different place politically than I am, but occasionally they vote for something good, and then I send them a note. Yay, you did the thing. How do we reach out to our legislators? We find the legislators' website or webpage, right? And our federal legislators all have web pages where we can send a message, send an email to them. They will always ask for our address because they want to know if you're a constituent, right? If they represent you. And if you're not a constituent, they don't care what you think. That is true at the state level too. You can look at your state legislative website and find information, contact information for your legislators. Sometimes you will find an email address for them as a legislator, but also an email address for like their political campaigns. Send it to the legislative email, right? You're not making a campaign donation. You're saying, you're my legislator, you represent me. So if you find more than one email address, that's the way to pay attention to which email address you should use. You can also call your legislators. You won't get them on the phone. You might get one of their aides or one of their interns on the phone, and then you can deliver your message to them and they will, take notes and pass it along. Maybe. Or you can leave a voicemail, right? And if that works better for you than sending an email, great. There are organizations that will ask you to sign on or send bulk emails where it's the same exact message, just with your name on it. And legislators know to ignore those. If you're not having to put any time or effort into crafting the email, they don't feel obliged to put any time or effort into having their staffers read it. So I don't recommend you do that. If, however, it's an organization giving you the opportunity to personalize or craft an email, then I would say, yeah, do that, but make sure you spend the time to personalize it enough so that it's a unique message. You can communicate in the media. If you are a good writer, you can submit a letter to the editor. If you regularly submit good letters to the editor, you can potentially, get op-eds posted. The difference between an op-ed and a letter to the editor, op-eds are usually longer, so it gives you more space to make your arguments. But because they take up more space on the page, even if that page is only digital, newspapers tend to be pickier about which op-eds they accept. But that's a way to reach a broader audience about your concerns about a bill or your support of a bill. It's also important to acknowledge that if you live in a really conservative state, like I do, I live in Utah, and Utah has a veto-proof Republican majority. And so some of these bills are being sponsored by Republicans and they will pass in Utah. That is just reality. But when a bill passes, there are still opportunities to kill it. One is to communicate to your governor. And sometimes the governor will veto a bill they find objectionable. There are also occasionally opportunities to help at the next level, because like I said earlier, some of these bills are clearly unconstitutional because they violate the Equal Protection Clause. And so there are a lot of equality organizations at the state level and at the national level who bring lawsuits against these bills to try to get them not taken down by the courts. Those lawsuits aren't cheap. So if you have money to spare, you can donate to the people who are funding the lawsuit. They also need plaintiffs. So what's a plaintiff? When you sue to have a bill overturned or law overturned, you have to show in court that there is a real person or real people who are harmed by this bill, right? And those people are the plaintiffs. And so when a bad bill passes, the organizations that want to get that overturned have to go on the hunt for a plaintiff, someone who is actually harmed by the bill. Now, in particular with the bills that target transgender minors, this is really a problem because the plaintiff has to be a minor to be someone who's harmed by the bill. And parents, understandably, have deep, deep concerns about putting their child forward as a plaintiff. But those lawsuits cannot proceed without them. And when we look at the history of the civil rights movement, particularly in regards to segregated schools in the area of separate but equal schools, right? I mean, Brown versus the Board of Education, that ruling happened because there were parents willing to put their child forward as a plaintiff. Lots of times the courts will try to defend the privacy of that minor child by making it anonymous. I know in Utah, a few years back, there was a lawsuit against Utah's so-called no promo homo law. What that law did was prohibit school teachers in school from doing or saying anything that might promote homosexuality. Now, what does it mean to promote homosexuality? I mean, that's just so incredibly vague in the first place. It was a terrible law. But the groups that sued to remove that needed to find young people who were harmed by that law, right? Who were denied access to information important to their lives or equal treatment because of that law, right? And the three minor plaintiffs were all anonymized in the lawsuit. They all chose to go public after the lawsuit was resolved and that law was overturned. But there are, attempts made to protect young children. And so it's not part of the conversation I used to think about very often. But now that a lot of these nasty bills are passing, it's a really important conversation to have, that we need courageous parents and courageous kids who can step forward to be plaintiffs. We can also vote, right? And the legislators that are in office running these horrible bills are there because they got elected. And we can vote, and we can encourage others to vote. We can talk about salience is the word. So people have things that are important to them, right? But then salience is where things are on that list, right? You may say, well, I care about LGBTQ rights, but it's not high enough on the list that I care enough about it that influences how I vote much, right? So that would be, they care about an issue, but it's not salient. It's not high enough on their list, right? And when we talk about these issues, we can talk about them in a way that invites other people to think about the rights of LGBTQ people when they vote. Okay, so now I want to kind of cycle back to resilience, because engaging in politics these days, when these hard, hurtful, hateful bills are running, can be very painful. It can make us feel very vulnerable. It can make us want to go into our bedrooms and draw the curtains and hide. And I can tell you some weeks this week when the Utah State Legislature was in session, when I came home from the Capitol and I laid down on my bed and I put my pillow over my head. It's just, So how do we be resilient in the face of the political reality that we are maybe feeling attacked or betrayed by the institutions that are supposed to protect our rights and the rights of our children? First, I want to point out that we need to survive, right? So most people don't have the bandwidth to be politically active about every issue, and it is true that we need to pick things to work on. It's also true that we need to look at the long term. And again, the fight for civil rights is such an excellent model for that. You look at the people who marched and fought and demonstrated and, for years, for decades in the civil rights movement. And they made real progress. But it was not made without long struggle. And maybe if we have elementary school age children, we need to find them age appropriate stories to read about some of the heroes of that struggle. If we have teenagers, maybe we, get them a copy of the, why can't I think of the name? It's called March. It's the graphic nonfiction autobiography of John Lewis, the great civil rights leader. And that, that graphic nonfiction format is a very appropriate way to share that struggle and to then have a conversation with our teens about what it means to be committed to making long-term change. And having that long-term view is an important element of resilience, not just for our children, but for us, right? Because we will need that long-term view. The hurtful bills that did not pass in 2022 in Utah got run in 2023, and some of them have passed, right? We will not just fight this battle 1 year and have it be one and done. And so we can, keep our eye on the prize, to use that civil rights slogan, and have that long view of the work we're trying to do, so that we can stay strong and focused and make the change we want in the world. And it may take a while. Finally, Affirmation is an organization for members and former members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Mormons. And so I will end on this note that people of faith can also rely on their faith as a tool of resilience to help them keep fighting for what is right. When we look at the civil rights movement, we can see that a lot of leaders in the civil rights movement were pastors. They were religious people sharing a religious message that the rights that they were seeking were rights that had been endowed by their creator. And I will close with that. We've got a couple of minutes. If you have anything you want to bring up or any questions you want to ask, not guaranteeing I can answer any of them.
Oh, I do. You mentioned that we can tell our stories and then follow it up with facts. And so are there some good resources? Does Affirmation, or do you have some good resources that we can tap into if we're going to be writing these letters and talking to people?
So my friend Sue Robbins is a transgender woman who posts a lot of useful information related specifically to the bills that target transgender people. So I can recommend her as a resource. And she has a website, and I think it is let's see. Yeah, the website is Sue, SUE, in UT for Utah, because that's where she lives. So let me put that in the chat. That's her website. And she is continuing to add to that, but is specifically trying to add resources, links to good articles and documents and stuff that you can use. I will warn you, when you click on that website for the first time, make sure you have a good block of time to spend, because, you know, if you're like me, you will find an interesting article to read and then you will get your brains vacuumed out and you'll spend an hour there. So, but I recommend that as a use source. I'll be there. We're going out to dinner in 3 minutes. So that's a useful one. And then also, when you're communicating to legislators, you can send them links to articles, particularly articles that are published in local papers that support your position, that have good facts. That's a useful thing to do.
Thank you.
Heidi, Shauna, did I miss anything?
Thank you so much. That was perfect. And that was really good information for people who are new to it and people who aren't, you know, just reminders of resilience and like the long view. I loved that. So thank you so much for joining us, Neca. You're amazing. Enjoy your dinner.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for coming, and we will see you next quarter.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Good night.
Much.